After this happened, I could never look at the world the same way again. Have you ever had the strange feeling that there's something behind everything that happens, something subtle but undeniable, and yet you can't explain what it is? Not an idea, not a belief, more like a quiet presence you sense in certain moments and then forget. That's exactly what happened to me. Nothing dramatic on the outside, no sudden revelation. Just an ordinary moment where a reaction started to rise, and instead of being pulled into it, I noticed it. The thought forming, the tension in the body, the urge to respond. And at the same time, something else was there, calmly aware of it all. What surprised me wasn't the reaction, it was the realization that I had seen this before, many times, but had never truly noticed it. What if I told you there's something you've already observed throughout your life, and once it becomes clear, you can't unsee it? Not because reality changes, but because the way you relate to it does. If you've ever felt that pull, continue watching. Not to agree with anything, just to notice. Have you ever arrived somewhere and suddenly realized you don't remember the journey at all? You locked the door, started the car, followed the streets, stopped at the lights, yet none of it feels real in memory. It's as if your body went there, but you weren't fully present. This isn't rare. In fact, for most people, this is the default state. Much of life is lived on autopilot. We wake up, repeat the same routines, respond to the same triggers, have the same thoughts about the same problems. We believe we are choosing, but most of the time we are simply reacting. Old habits decide what we eat. Old emotions decide how we speak. Old fears decide what we avoid. And because this happens quietly, smoothly, efficiently, we assume it must be normal. We assume this is what being awake feels like. But notice something subtle. When you're on autopilot, time behaves strangely. Hours disappear. Days blur together. Weeks pass faster than they should. It's not because life is speeding up. It's because very little of it is being consciously registered. Awareness isn't involved, so memory doesn't anchor the experience. It's like watching a movie while scrolling on your phone. The film plays, but nothing really lands. Autopilot is useful. It helps you survive. It saves energy. Your nervous system loves efficiency. Once it learns a pattern, it runs it automatically, so you don't have to think. The problem isn't that autopilot exists. The problem is that most people never step out of it. They live entire decades governed by invisible scripts written long ago, often in childhood, often in moments of stress, without ever realizing those scripts can be seen. And here's the uncomfortable part. When you're on autopilot, you don't feel imprisoned. You feel normal. You might even feel busy, productive, opinionated, emotionally invested. Autopilot doesn't feel empty. It feels full of noise, thoughts talking over each other, emotional reactions that feel urgent and personal, a constant sense that something needs fixing, proving, defending. Because of that noise, the deeper absence goes unnoticed. Pay attention to how quickly the mind labels everything. Good, bad, annoying, interesting, dangerous, boring. Those labels appear instantly without effort. You don't decide them. They decide themselves. And once the label is there, your reaction follows automatically. Mood shifts, body tightens, words come out. Actions unfold. All of it happens so fast that it feels like me. But is it? Autopilot thrives on speed. It doesn't pause. It doesn't question. It moves straight from stimulus to reaction. Someone says something, and before you know it, you're offended. A memory appears and suddenly your chest is tight. A worry crosses the mind and your body responds as if the threat is real. The machine runs smoothly, efficiently, invisibly. And because it's invisible, most people assume that's all there is. They assume consciousness is just thinking, or feeling, or reacting. They assume awareness is identical to the content moving through it. But autopilot depends on one thing above all else: that you don't notice the process itself. The moment you truly see it happening, even briefly, something shifts. Think about the last time you caught yourself mid-reaction. Maybe you were about to say something sharp and suddenly paused. Maybe you noticed tension rising and chose not to feed it. That tiny interruption didn't come from the autopilot system. It came from somewhere else, something quieter, something that wasn't rushing. Most people miss those moments because they don't know they matter. They brush them off and fall right back into the stream. But those interruptions are cracks in the machinery, glimpses that there is more here than mechanical reaction. Autopilot isn't just about habits, it shapes identity. When the same reactions repeat long enough, they start to feel like who I am. I'm just an anxious person. I've always been like this. That's just my personality. But what if much of what you call yourself is simply repetition unnoticed? This is where things begin to get interesting and uncomfortable, because if most people are living mechanically, not out of choice but out of momentum, then the real question isn't why life feels unsatisfying or repetitive. The real question is, who exactly is noticing that something feels off? There is something in you that can observe the autopilot instead of being inside it. You may not recognize it yet. You may not trust it. But it has been present every time you realized you weren't fully there. And once that realization starts to sharpen, another layer reveals itself. A blind spot in how human perception works. Something we are almost perfectly designed not to see. There is a strange fact about your vision that most people never think about. Right now, as you read these words, there is a small area in your field of sight where you see absolutely nothing. Not darkness, not blur, nothing at all. Your brain quietly fills it in so convincingly that you would swear your vision is complete. This is called a blind spot, and the unsettling part isn't that it exists, it's that you live as if it doesn't. Human perception works like this in more ways than we realize. Your mind is constantly filtering reality. It decides what deserves attention and what should be ignored long before you're aware of it. Sounds fade into the background. Sensations are dismissed. Details are erased. Not because they aren't there, but because they don't seem useful for survival, reward, or threat. The brain is efficient, not truthful. It doesn't show you reality as it is. It shows you a version that helps you function. And just like with vision, the mind fills in the gaps. You assume you know why you feel the way you feel. You assume your reactions make sense. You assume you're seeing situations clearly. But much of what you call what's happening is an internal reconstruction, not a direct perception. The blind spot isn't just visual, it's psychological, emotional, existential. Notice how rarely you question your own point of view. You question other people all the time, but your own interpretation feels solid, obvious, unquestionable. That's part of the blind spot. The mind is designed to trust itself. Doubting your own perception would feel destabilizing, so the system protects itself by hiding its own limitations. This is why two people can experience the same moment and walk away with completely different realities. Each one believes they saw what really happened. Each one feels justified. Each one is unaware of how much was filtered, ignored, or distorted before awareness even arrived. The blind spot becomes even more powerful when emotions are involved. Strong emotion narrows perception. When you're afraid, you see threat everywhere. When you're angry, you see offense everywhere. When you're attached to an outcome, you see confirmation everywhere. The mind locks onto a single storyline and everything else disappears. And because that narrowing happens instantly, it feels like clarity rather than contraction. You don't experience it as, I'm missing something. You experience it as, I'm right. What makes this more subtle is that the blind spot cannot be found by thinking harder. Thinking is part of the same system that creates it. Trying to analyze your way out of it is like using your eyes to see the place where your eyes don't work. The effort just reinforces the illusion of control. This is why people can spend years reading, learning, discussing ideas about awareness, and still live completely trapped inside automatic perception. Information doesn't touch the blind spot. Concepts don't disturb it. The blind spot survives by staying outside the field of attention itself. And yet you've already brushed against it. Every time you felt a quiet sense that something was missing, even when life looked fine on the surface. Every time you noticed a reaction happening before you could stop it. Every time you caught yourself thinking, why do I always do this? Those moments point directly toward what you cannot normally see. The blind spot hides the mechanism of experience. You see thoughts but not how they arise. You feel emotions but not the instant they take shape. You perceive the world, but not the filter through which it's being perceived. The result is a constant sense of being inside the experience, never outside of it, never able to see the frame. This is why autopilot feels so convincing. If you cannot perceive the system that's running you, it feels like freedom. If you cannot see the filtered reality feels like truth. The blind spot doesn't feel like absence, it feels like certainty. But something begins to shift when you stop trying to understand what you're experiencing and instead become curious about how it's being experienced, not intellectually, gently, almost experimentally, as if you're noticing the edge of something rather than the thing itself. At first, this can feel disorienting. The mind doesn't like being observed. It prefers to be the observer. When that role is questioned, there's often confusion, resistance, even discomfort. That reaction itself is part of the pattern, another movement arising inside awareness. And this is where a deeper misunderstanding quietly reveals itself. Most people believe consciousness is identical to the thoughts, feelings, and perceptions passing through them. They assume awareness is busy, noisy, personal, reactive. But what if that assumption is part of the blind spot itself? What if what you call consciousness is only the surface activity, and the thing that notices all of it has been overlooked from the beginning? Most people believe consciousness is whatever is happening in their head right now. The thoughts, the emotions, the inner voice commenting on everything. If there is noise, they assume consciousness is noisy. If there is confusion, they assume consciousness is confused. If there is fear, they assume consciousness itself is afraid. This assumption feels so obvious that it's rarely questioned. But notice something carefully. When thoughts are loud, you know they are loud. When emotions surge, you are aware of the surge. When the mind is restless, you can recognize the restlessness. That recognition is not the same thing as what is being recognized. If consciousness were the thoughts themselves, there would be no way to notice them. A wave cannot observe itself as a wave, and yet you can watch a thought appear, stay for a moment, and fade. You can sense an emotion rise in the body and dissolve. Something remains present throughout all of it, quietly, consistently, without effort. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Consciousness is not an activity. It's not something that moves. It doesn't argue, judge, or rush. Those are functions of the mind. Consciousness is the space in which those functions appear. Think about a room. Furniture can be rearranged. People can enter and leave. Music can play loudly or softly. None of that changes the room itself. The room doesn't get anxious when the music is loud. It doesn't get depressed when the room is empty. It simply allows whatever happens inside it. In the same way, awareness doesn't take on the qualities of what passes through it. Yet most people live as if the furniture is the room. Because attention is almost always glued to content, the container is forgotten. You're trained from an early age to focus on what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what's happening to you. No one teaches you to notice the fact that all of this is being noticed. So consciousness gets confused with its own contents. This confusion has consequences. When you believe consciousness is thinking, you try to fix your life by fixing your thoughts. When you believe consciousness is emotion, you try to control or suppress feelings. When you believe awareness is personal, fragile, and reactive, you live in a constant state of defense. But observe your own experience for a moment. Even in your most intense emotional states, there is a subtle sense of being aware of the intensity. Even in confusion, there is awareness of confusion. Even in fear, there is something that knows fear is present. That knowing is not panicking. It's not lost. It's simply there. This doesn't mean thoughts or emotions disappear. It means they are no longer mistaken for the one who sees them. The mind will try to turn this into an idea. It will say, I understand this. But understanding is not the point. You can understand fire intellectually and still get burned. Consciousness isn't something to grasp. It's something to recognize, in the same way you recognize light without needing to touch it. This recognition often feels almost too simple, which is why it's dismissed. The mind expects transformation to be dramatic, effortful, complex. But awareness has never been hidden. It's only been overlooked, like glasses sitting on your face while you search the house for them. When this starts to become clear, the relationship with experience subtly changes. Thoughts lose some of their authority. Emotions move more freely. Reactions still happen, but they're seen rather than obeyed. Life doesn't become quiet, but it becomes more spacious. And yet, another subtle mistake can appear here. The mind may try to claim this awareness. It may say, "This is my consciousness. I am doing this. I am being aware." But notice, awareness was present before that thought appeared, and it remains after it passes. You didn't create it. You didn't turn it on. It doesn't require maintenance. It doesn't need your effort to exist. This is why moments of deep presence often happen when you stop trying. When you're absorbed in something simple, when you're watching the sky, listening to music, or sitting in silence. The sense of a separate me relaxes, and awareness stands on its own, unnoticed but undeniable. Most people miss this because they're waiting for consciousness to feel special, but it feels ordinary, neutral, intimate. It's the most familiar thing you've ever known, which is why it's so hard to point to. As this begins to register, a quiet question naturally arises. If awareness is always here, unchanged by what passes through it, then what exactly has been observing your thoughts, your emotions, your entire life, from the very beginning? That question doesn't demand an answer. It invites a shift in attention, away from the noise, toward the one who notices the noise. And once that shift starts, something unmistakable comes into view. The presence of an inner observer that has never spoken, never argued, and never left. There is something quietly present in every moment of your life that has never aged, never been injured, never been confused. It was there when you were a child before you knew your name. It was there during your most emotional memories. It is here now, reading these words, and yet it rarely gets your attention. This presence doesn't speak in sentences. It doesn't interrupt. It doesn't demand belief, it simply notices. When you remember a moment from years ago, notice what's actually happening. The image appears, the feeling may return, but the one who is aware of the memory feels strangely unchanged. The body is older, the story is different, but the sense of being aware is familiar in a way nothing else is. That familiarity is not nostalgia, it's continuity. Thoughts come and go, roles change, identities are built and discarded, but the one who sees these changes never needed to announce itself. It was too close, too obvious, like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. Most people assume the observer is something they must create, through effort, discipline, or spiritual practice. But anything you create can disappear. The observer doesn't appear and vanish. It doesn't turn on and off. It doesn't improve with age or decline with stress. It has been present in every state you've ever been in, including the moments when you felt most lost. Even when you say, "I wasn't aware back then," notice that you are aware of that lack of awareness now. Something was still there to register the absence. This is why the observer is so easy to miss. It doesn't feel like an object. It has no shape, no personality, no opinion. The mind looks for something it can point to, name, or control. But the observer isn't a thing inside experience. It's what experience appears within. Pay attention to how effortlessly it operates. You don't need to remind yourself to be aware of sounds. Hearing just happens. You don't need to force yourself to notice sensations. They're already noticed. Awareness doesn't strain, it doesn't focus, it receives. And yet almost all of your attention is spent on what appears, not on what allows appearing. The observer doesn't compete with thoughts. It doesn't argue with emotions. It doesn't push against reactions. It allows them to rise, stay, and fall. This is why it feels calm even when the mind is chaotic, not because it suppresses chaos, but because it isn't threatened by it. At first, recognizing this can feel subtle, even underwhelming. There's no dramatic shift, no fireworks, just a quiet sense of, "Oh, this has always been here." The mind may immediately try to turn that into a concept, a belief, a new identity, but the observer doesn't need to be believed in. It doesn't require agreement. It's present even when you doubt it. In fact, doubt itself is observed. Skepticism appears, lingers, and dissolves, and something notices the entire process. That something is not persuaded or discouraged by the doubt. It doesn't take sides. It doesn't feel offended. This is where many people get confused. They think the observer is passive, distant, or detached, but it's not separate from life. It's intimate with every sensation. It's closer than thought, closer than emotion. It's the reason any experience feels immediate at all. Without the observer, there would be no pain, but also no pleasure, no meaning, no confusion, no clarity. The observer is not opposed to life. It is the condition that makes life appear. Once this begins to register, the sense of being trapped inside your thoughts starts to loosen. You may notice reactions happening without being pulled fully into them. You may feel emotions without being consumed. This doesn't mean reactions stop. It means they're no longer mistaken for the one who sees, and this is where a profound shift quietly begins. If there is an observer that has always been present, unchanged by the content of experience, then what you've been calling me might not be what you thought. The voice in your head, the stream of thoughts, the emotional patterns, all of those are seen, which raises a simple but unsettling realization. If you can observe your thoughts, your emotions, and even your sense of self, then what exactly are you? For most of your life, thoughts have felt personal. They speak in your voice. They comment on your choices. They tell stories about who you are and what the world means. Because they sound so familiar, it feels natural to assume they are you. But look closer, not philosophically, just honestly. A thought appears. You didn't invite it. You didn't plan it. It simply shows up. Then it changes, contradicts itself, or disappears altogether. Another replaces it. If you were your thoughts, you would have to disappear when they do. Yet something remains, steady and present, watching the stream move by. This isn't a metaphor. It's happening right now. Try to notice the next thought before it appears. You can't. The mind doesn't consult you before thinking. Thoughts arise on their own, triggered by memory, sensation, habit, or emotion. They arrive fully formed, carrying opinions, fears, plans, and judgments, and they expect obedience. Because they arrive so quickly, most people don't question their authority. A thought says, "This is a problem," and the body tenses. A thought says, "I'm not enough," and the chest tightens. A thought says, "This will never work," and motivation collapses. Life bends around these sentences as if they were facts. But notice the difference between a thought and the awareness of a thought. One moves, the other doesn't. Thoughts are restless by nature. They jump forward and backward in time. They replay the past and rehearse the future. Awareness, on the other hand, is always now. It doesn't chase. It doesn't wander. It's already here when a thought arrives, and it's still here after the thought leaves. This is the simplest way to see it. If you can hear a voice, you are not the voice. You are the one listening. The mind resists this realization because it feels destabilizing. If you are not your thoughts, then what have you been defending all this time? Who has been arguing? Who has been worried? Who has been trying so hard to control outcomes? The mind prefers identification because identification gives it importance. But identification comes with a cost. When you believe you are your thoughts, every thought feels like a threat or a command. Negative thoughts feel like personal attacks. Repetitive thoughts feel like traps. Intrusive thoughts feel dangerous. You become trapped in a constant negotiation with the mind, trying to replace one thought with another, as if switching actors will change the play. And yet, have you ever noticed that the most peaceful moments in your life weren't moments of better thinking, but moments of less identification? Times when the mind was quiet, or when thoughts were present but didn't carry weight. The relief didn't come from control, it came from distance. This distance doesn't mean suppression. Suppressed thoughts fight back. They grow louder, heavier, more insistent. Seeing thoughts as thoughts allows them to pass without resistance. Like clouds moving across the sky, they only seem solid when you forget they're moving. The moment you notice a thought as an object rather than a truth, something loosens. You don't need to argue with it. You don't need to believe it. You don't need to get rid of it. You simply see it. And here's the subtle shift. Seeing a thought doesn't require effort. It happens naturally when awareness is no longer fused with content. The thought loses its grip, not because it's defeated, but because it's seen clearly. This is why trying to stop thinking rarely works. The attempt itself is another thought, the mind fighting the mind. But when you recognize that you are not the thinker, The struggle loses its purpose. The mind can think. That's its job. You don't have to be inside every sentence it produces. Notice how thoughts constantly claim ownership. My life. My problem. My future. My past. They create a sense of a central character who must manage everything. But that character is also a thought. A persistent one, but still a thought. When this starts to become obvious, a new kind of freedom appears. Not freedom from thought, but freedom within thought. Thoughts can arise without defining you. They can inform without commanding. They can pass without leaving scars. This doesn't make you passive or disconnected. It makes you available, responsive instead of reactive, clear instead of tangled. The mind still functions, but it no longer runs the entire system unchecked. And then something even more precise becomes visible. If thoughts are not you, and if awareness is watching them, then the real point of transformation isn't in changing what you think. It's in noticing when a thought pulls you into automatic reaction, the exact instant when awareness gets lost and identification takes over. That instant is brief, almost invisible, but it's where everything shifts. There is a moment so small that most people never notice it, yet it quietly shapes the direction of their lives. It happens before words, before decisions, before action. It's the instant when an impulse is born, not the reaction itself, but the spark that precedes it. Someone speaks, and before a thought fully forms, something tightens in the body. A sensation in the chest, a heat in the face, a subtle rush forward. That is the impulse. It arrives faster than language, faster than logic. By the time the mind explains what's happening, the impulse has already set things in motion. Most reactions don't begin with thinking. They begin with sensation. The body reacts first. The nervous system evaluates safety or threat in fractions of a second. Only afterward does the mind step in to justify, narrate, and defend. This is why you often realize what you've said or done only after it's already happened. The explanation comes later, dressed up as choice. But between the stimulus and the full reaction, there is a brief opening. Not a gap you create, but one that already exists. It's subtle, easy to miss. And once missed, everything feels automatic. At first, this impulse doesn't feel dangerous. It feels compelling, urgent, necessary. It says, speak now. Defend yourself. Withdraw. Check your phone. Fix this immediately. The energy moves forward, and awareness is pulled along with it. The key isn't to stop the impulse. You can't. Impulses arise from conditioning, biology, memory, and habit. Trying to block them only creates tension. The shift happens when the impulse is seen the moment it appears, before it turns into action. This noticing doesn't look dramatic. It's almost like catching yourself leaning before you fall. A quiet recognition. This is an impulse. No judgment, no strategy, just seeing. When that happens, something remarkable occurs. The impulse still exists, but it no longer owns you. It doesn't disappear, but it loosens. The body may still feel charged, but awareness is no longer fused with the movement. For the first time, there is space. This space is not something you force open. It reveals itself when attention stops chasing the impulse and instead rests with it. The sensation is allowed to be there without immediately being translated into behavior. Most people never experience this because their attention is trained on outcomes, not origins. They notice the argument, not the tightening that preceded it. They notice the habit, not the urge that activated it. They notice regret, not the first flicker of momentum. This is why change feels so difficult. By the time you try to intervene, the process is already complete. It's like trying to stop a river by pushing the water downstream. The real leverage is upstream, at the source. The impulse is that source. At first, noticing it may feel uncomfortable. The body wants resolution. The mind wants to act. Staying present with raw impulse can feel exposed, even unsafe. But notice something important. The discomfort is tolerable. It rises, peaks, and falls. It does not last forever. The urgency promised by the impulse is often an illusion. This is where awareness becomes embodied, not abstract, not philosophical. You feel the pull. You sense the charge, and you remain present anyway. Over time, this noticing becomes more familiar. You start to recognize the early signals, the tightening jaw, the shallow breath, the restless energy in the hands. These are not problems to fix. They are information, signals that an automatic pattern is activating. And once you see that activation, you're no longer inside it. You are with it. This doesn't mean you never act. It means action is no longer compulsory. You can still speak, move, decide, but the action comes from clarity rather than compulsion. The difference is subtle but profound. You may notice that the same impulse appears again and again in similar situations, the same emotional hook, the same urge to protect, prove, escape, or control. This repetition reveals something important. Impulses are impersonal. They are patterns, not identities. Seeing this can be unsettling. If these impulses are not you, then what have you been obeying all this time? What has been driving your decisions, your conflicts, your habits? And yet this realization carries a quiet relief, because if the impulse can be seen, it can be met with awareness. And if awareness is present, the chain from impulse to reaction is no longer automatic. This is where something irreversible begins to happen. Once you start noticing impulses at their birth, you begin to see them everywhere, not just in yourself, but in others. You notice how conversations are driven by unseen urges, how conflicts escalate mechanically, how people speak and act without ever touching the space before movement. And once this perception stabilizes, something shifts permanently, because when you truly see the mechanism, you can't pretend you don't see it anymore. There is a point where perception quietly crosses a line. Nothing dramatic announces it. No sound, no clear before and after moment. And yet, something becomes obvious in a way it never was before. You see a pattern, not as an idea, but as a fact. And from that moment on, pretending not to see it feels impossible. This is how awareness changes you. Once you begin noticing impulses before they turn into reactions, once you recognize thoughts as events rather than commands, the world starts to look different. Not because it changed, but because the mechanism behind behavior becomes visible. You start to see how often actions are driven by habit rather than choice, fear rather than clarity. At first, this seeing is mostly internal. You notice it in your own body. A reaction begins, and part of you is already aware of it. The surprise is not that the reaction happens, but that awareness is present at the same time. The old pattern still moves, but it no longer feels invisible. Then something unexpected happens. You begin to see the same patterns outside yourself. You notice how quickly people react to being challenged, how rarely someone actually listens without preparing a response, how conversations are often two monologues colliding. You see how emotions jump from one person to another without anyone noticing the transfer. Tension spreads, not because of the situation itself, but because no one sees the impulses being passed around. This can feel strange at first, almost like stepping half a step back from the world. You're still involved, still human, still emotional, but you're not fully hypnotized. You see the strings moving, even as the play continues. This shift can bring a sense of distance, not superiority but separation. You may feel less compelled to argue, less interested in proving a point, not because you've become passive, but because you can see how predictable the escalation is. The outcome is already written in the impulse. Sometimes this creates loneliness. When awareness deepens, it can feel like fewer people are meeting you at the same level of presence. You notice how often interactions are driven by roles and scripts. You might feel like you're watching a familiar movie, while others are fully absorbed in it. And yet there is also a quiet relief. You no longer need to participate in every emotional current that passes through the room. You can feel anger without being consumed by it. You can hear criticism without collapsing or retaliating. You can sense tension without feeding it. This doesn't make you detached from life. It makes you less entangled. Once you see this, you can't go back to believing that reactions are inevitable. You can't fully believe that this is just how I am, or this is just how people are. The spell is broken, even if the patterns still appear. The mind may try to reassert control. It may say this is dangerous, you'll become disconnected, you'll lose motivation, you'll stop caring. But notice that this fear is just another thought, another impulse, another movement being seen. Awareness doesn't disappear when the mind protests. What actually changes is responsibility. When you no longer believe you are your reactions, you also can't blame them on the world so easily. You see how often suffering is created not by events, but by unconscious response. This isn't a reason for guilt. It's an invitation to honesty. You begin to notice how often discomfort arises not from what happens, but from resisting what's already happening. How often conflict is fueled by the need to be right, safe, or seen. How much energy is spent maintaining identities built on reaction. Seeing this doesn't turn you into an observer floating above life. It turns you into a participant with clarity. But clarity has a cost. You can no longer unsee your own patterns. When irritation arises, you feel it earlier. When defensiveness appears, you recognize it sooner. When avoidance activates, it's exposed. There's less room for denial, but also less room for self-deception. This is where many people hesitate. They sense that continuing down this path means letting go of comforting illusions. It means no longer hiding behind stories. It means meeting experience more directly. And yet something deeper begins to stabilize. Even as illusions fall, something remains untouched. The same awareness that noticed impulses, thoughts, and reactions is still here, unchanged, quiet, reliable. It doesn't collapse when patterns are seen. It doesn't disappear when certainty dissolves. In fact, as illusions drop away, awareness becomes more obvious. And this sets the stage for a deeper realization. When you can no longer unsee the mechanics of reaction, when you can no longer fully believe the stories the mind tells, another layer begins to fall, including the illusions you've held about yourself. At a certain point, the shift becomes personal. It's no longer just about seeing how reactions work or how the mind creates stories. The focus turns inward, toward the image you've been carrying of yourself. Not the public version, but the quiet assumptions you rarely question. You begin to notice how many of your conflicts depend on a particular story about who you are, the one who needs to be respected, the one who must stay in control, the one who avoids disappointment by expecting the worst. These identities feel solid because they've been repeated for years. They explain your behavior, they justify your reactions, they give you a sense of continuity. But once awareness is present, these stories start to wobble. You notice how differently you show up in different situations. Calm here, defensive there, confident one moment, insecure the next. If there were a fixed self behind all of this, it would behave consistently. Instead, what you find are patterns responding to conditions. This realization can feel unsettling at first. The mind wants a stable center. It wants a clear definition. But what begins to fall away is not something essential. It's the illusion of solidity. You see how often your suffering comes from protecting an image of being right, being good, being strong, being understood. When that image is threatened, tension rises automatically, the body tightens, the mind prepares its arguments. All of this happens in service of something that turns out to be more fragile than you thought. And once you see that, you can't fully believe in it again. This doesn't mean you stop functioning in the world. You still have preferences, boundaries, and responsibilities. But the emotional charge around identity softens. You're less compelled to defend every opinion, less devastated when you make a mistake, less inflated when things go well. The illusion that falls is the idea that your worth depends on maintaining a particular narrative. Another illusion begins to crack as well. The belief that your thoughts are always telling you the truth. Not just that they're your thoughts, but that they accurately represent reality. You start to see how often interpretation is mistaken for fact, how quickly meaning is assigned, how rarely that meaning is questioned. A situation happens, the mind explains it, emotion follows the explanation. Reaction follows the emotion, and before that sequence felt seamless, invisible. Now it's exposed. You begin to notice how much unnecessary suffering is created by these interpretations, how often you replay conversations, invent intentions, predict outcomes that never happen. The mind fills the unknown with certainty, and certainty becomes tension. Seeing this doesn't make you immune to it. Thoughts still arise, interpretations still form, but they no longer carry the same weight. They're seen as possibilities, not verdicts. This is where clarity deepens. As illusions fall, something else becomes obvious. Much of what you've been fighting against was never actually happening. You weren't reacting to reality itself, but to your version of it. And when that version loosens, the emotional grip loosens with it. There can be moments of grief here. Grief for the time spent defending stories that didn't need defending. Grief for the energy lost to fear, resentment, or self-doubt. This grief is quiet, not dramatic. It comes with honesty rather than regret. And alongside it, there is relief. Relief that you don't have to carry so much mental armor anymore. Relief that you can be wrong without falling apart. Relief that you can not know without feeling threatened. The world becomes less rigid, less demanding. As this happens, your relationship with experience changes. Instead of trying to control every outcome, you become more interested in seeing clearly. Instead of needing certainty, you develop tolerance for ambiguity. Instead of chasing emotional highs or avoiding lows, you begin to trust awareness itself. This doesn't make life flat, it makes it more direct. Moments feel more immediate. Emotions pass more freely. Decisions feel simpler, even when they're difficult. You're less pulled into internal drama, not because you've suppressed it, but because you no longer mistake it for truth. And this clarity starts to reorganize how you live. You begin to act less from habit and more from presence, less from fear and more from understanding. The external world hasn't changed, but the way you meet it has, which leads to another subtle shift. As illusions fall, you start to notice that life isn't meant to be managed from the outside in. Control weakens, trust grows, and experience begins to move through you rather than against you. Something inside recognizes that it can respond instead of react. And from there, life starts to be lived from a very different place. Something subtle but decisive begins to reorganize the way life moves through you. Not because you made a rule or adopted a belief, but because the center of gravity quietly shifted. Instead of being pushed and pulled by events, moods, and other people, you start to feel anchored somewhere deeper. Before, life felt like it was happening to you. Circumstances dictated your inner state. A good day outside meant relief inside. A difficult interaction meant tension for hours. Your sense of balance depended on things lining up just right. That way of living feels normal because it's common, but it's exhausting. Now the direction reverses. You begin to notice that clarity doesn't come from fixing the world first. It comes from how you meet the world. When awareness is present, situations don't automatically define you. They inform you, but they don't hijack you. This doesn't mean emotions disappear. You still feel joy, sadness, irritation, excitement. The difference is where those emotions land. Instead of pulling you into reaction, they move through a larger space. You feel them fully, but they don't collapse your sense of self. You may notice this first in small moments. A comment that would have lingered now passes more quickly. A delay that would have triggered impatience feels manageable. A disagreement doesn't automatically turn into a battle. These aren't acts of discipline. They happen because awareness is already present before reaction takes over. Living from the inside out doesn't make you passive. It actually makes action cleaner. When decisions come from clarity rather than pressure, they require less justification. You don't need to convince yourself or others as much. You see what needs to be done and you do it. Or you see that nothing needs to be done and you allow that too. This changes relationships in subtle ways. You listen more fully, not because you're trying to be kind, but because you're not rehearsing your response. You speak more simply, not because you're censoring yourself, but because there's less noise to push through. Boundaries become clearer, not harsher. People may notice something different about you. They might not know how to name it. You're still the same person, but less reactive, less predictable, less pulled into drama. Some will feel more at ease around you. Others may feel unsettled, because unconscious patterns often rely on mutual participation. Living from the inside out also changes how you experience time. When you're not constantly chasing or resisting the present moment, time feels fuller. Ordinary moments regain texture. A walk, a conversation, Even silence carries more weight. Not because it's special, but because you're actually there. You may also notice a growing trust in yourself, though it doesn't feel like confidence. It feels quieter than that. It's the trust that you can meet whatever arises without immediately losing your center. You don't need to predict every outcome or control every variable. You know you can respond. This trust doesn't come from thinking positively. It comes from repeated experience. Again and again, awareness is present. Again and again, reactions are seen rather than obeyed. Again and again, life moves on without the catastrophe the mind predicted. And yet, there is a paradox here. As you live more from the inside out, the urge to manage yourself diminishes. You stop trying to optimize every emotion or improve every moment. The drive to constantly adjust, fix, or correct starts to soften. Not because you've given up, but because you see how much effort was unnecessary. This can feel strange. The mind may whisper that you're becoming complacent, that you should be doing more, trying harder. But when you look closely, you see that life is still unfolding. Decisions are still being made. Growth is still happening. It's just no longer driven by tension. You begin to act without the constant sense of urgency. You move without pushing. You rest without guilt. Even effort feels different, less like struggle, more like alignment. This is where many people get confused. They think awakening means constant effort or constant awareness. But what you're discovering is the opposite. Awareness doesn't need to be maintained. It's already here. What falls away is the habit of interfering. And as interference decreases, something deeper becomes visible. You start to notice that the most profound changes happen when you stop trying to change yourself. When you stop manipulating experience to fit an idea of how it should be. When observation replaces control, this realization carries a quiet shock. If so much clarity comes from not forcing anything, then what has all that effort been about? What happens when you let awareness do what it naturally does? See, allow, respond, without the ego constantly stepping in to manage the process. That question doesn't demand an answer. It opens the door to a final paradox that changes everything. At some point, a quiet realization settles in, almost against your expectations. The more you tried to improve yourself, the heavier everything felt. The more you chased clarity, the more restless the mind became. And yet, in the moments when you stopped pushing, when effort softened and control relaxed, something opened on its own. This is the paradox few people are prepared for. Real change does not come from force. It comes from seeing. For most of your life, change has meant effort. Fixing habits, replacing thoughts, controlling emotions, becoming a better version of yourself. All of that assumes there is something fundamentally wrong that needs constant correction. And that assumption keeps the mind in charge, always evaluating, always comparing, always dissatisfied. But notice what actually happens when you stop trying to manage your inner world. Thoughts still arise, but they don't feel like enemies. Emotions still move, but they're not treated as problems to solve. Sensations come and go without being labeled as success or failure. Life continues, but without the constant commentary about how it should be different. In that space, awareness becomes obvious. When you stop trying to change your experience, you finally see it clearly. And clarity itself begins to reorganize behavior, not through discipline, but through understanding. When you truly see how suffering is created, you don't need to force yourself to avoid it. The pattern loses its appeal on its own. This is why effort-based change often fails. You can suppress a habit for a while, but the impulse remains. You can replace one belief with another, but the tension stays. The mind may comply, but the body doesn't. Eventually, the old patterns return, sometimes stronger than before. But when you stop interfering and simply observe, something deeper learns. The nervous system begins to settle when it's not constantly being pushed. The body feels safer when emotions are allowed rather than controlled. The mind relaxes when it's not required to produce constant improvement. From that relaxation, more intelligent responses emerge. This doesn't mean you become inactive. Action still happens, decisions are still made, but they arise from clarity rather than compulsion. You act because it's appropriate, not because you're trying to fix yourself or prove something. The ego struggles with this idea. It wants credit. It wants progress it can measure. It wants to say, I did this. But the most meaningful shifts don't belong to the ego. They happen when the ego steps aside. This can feel unsettling at first. If you're not trying to change, what are you doing? If you're not managing yourself, who's in control? These questions come from the same system that created the struggle in the first place. When you look honestly, you see that life has always been happening without your effort. Your heart beats, your breath moves, understanding arises, healing unfolds. Awareness has never needed instruction. The paradox is not that effort is wrong. It's that effort has limits. It works in the external world. You can build, plan, adjust. But internally, force creates resistance. Control creates contraction. Trying to fix the self strengthens the illusion that the self is broken. When that illusion relaxes, something simple remains. You find yourself responding instead of reacting, pausing instead of pushing, listening instead of defending, not because you memorized a rule, but because awareness is present before the impulse takes over. And perhaps the most surprising change is this: you care less about changing, and life changes more. There is more ease in the body, more honesty in relationships, more patience with uncertainty. You stop measuring yourself against imaginary standards. You begin to trust direct experience over mental commentary. This is not a final state. It's not an achievement. It's a way of meeting each moment without adding unnecessary resistance. Some days are still messy. Emotions still surge. Old patterns still appear. The difference is that none of it threatens your sense of being. You are no longer trying to become someone else. You are simply here noticing, and in that noticing, the endless project of self-improvement quietly dissolves. What remains is not perfection, but presence, not control, but coherence, not effort, but alignment with how life already moves. Everything changes not because you made it change, but because you stopped getting in the way. If you've stayed with this until now, something in you already recognizes what was being pointed to, not as an idea, but as an experience. Once that recognition happens, life doesn't go back to how it was. You still think, feel, react, and choose, but you're no longer completely inside it. There is awareness now. And awareness changes the relationship with everything it touches. The one who notices this is never quite the same again, not because life becomes perfect, but because it becomes honest. You begin to see when the mind is pulling you, when the body is reacting, and when clarity is present. That seeing becomes a quiet anchor you can return to again and again. So here's a simple question to leave you with. Will you continue living as if everything happens automatically, or will you stay with the act of noticing? If this reached you, write this sentence in the comments. I notice the one who notices. That's how I'll know you made it to the end. And if this felt meaningful, watch one of the videos appearing on your screen now. They continue this exploration from a different angle with the same depth. If you want more content like this, stay with it.